Welcome to my podcast that covers civilians during the Second World War. In today's episode, we will cover the topic of rationing in Britain during World War II. In this episode, I will question the common assumption that British rationing was characterised by universal self-sacrifice and common purpose. My research has found that while the notion of fair shares for all was a principal theme of wartime propaganda, the experience of rationing was actually varied among different social groups and classes in Britain. I will first start by talking about what the system of rationing was in Britain. The basic premise of the system was simple. Firstly, individuals would register with their local retailers. Then a limited allowance of basic foodstuffs, furniture and clothing was obtained by individuals in exchange for coupons. If a person's coupons had already been deposited, it was illegal for a shopkeeper to sell any more rationed products to the customer. Everyone in Britain received the same amount of coupons in what was called a flat ration for all. This was an excellent tool of propaganda as it promoted the image of universal self-sacrifice. However, the flat rations ignored the high-calorie intake of heavy workers at one end of the spectrum and the low-calorie intake of small children at the other end of the spectrum. The commodities initially rationed at the start of the war in 1940 were sugar, butter, bacon, ham and tea, all of which were predominantly imported into the country. So therefore they had to be rationed because the ships that were importing them into the country were being attacked by the German forces. So now I will talk about the responses of different social groups towards rationing. We'll first start by looking at the working class. The poorer sections of the working class actually benefited from the policy of rationing in some ways. This was because before the war there was a massive inequality in the nutrient intake, and these differences disappeared with the introduction of rationing. This is because the working class got access to the essential foodstuffs that they weren't able to access before the war. However, the working class as a whole experienced a number of issues with the system of rationing. Workers in heavy industry were particularly dissatisfied with the rationing of meat, which was highly prized as a marker of status and male privilege in the working class diet. In fact, roughly 72% of these workers felt that their diet was inadequate, and they largely blamed this on the system of flat rationing, which made no allowances for their differential energy requirements. This made meat the most politically sensitive of all rationed foods. In fact, the Minister of Labour at the time, Ernest Bevin, he considered the low rationing of meat in 1941 to be a serious danger to morale, and argued that an increase in the supply of meat would have a great effect on increasing morale for the war effort. But grievances didn't just come from industrial workers; they also came from the housewives of people in the working class. This is because when they went shopping at their local retailers, they often complained about the shortages and high prices of unrationed goods, which included products such as fish, fresh fruit, and vegetables. Neither last complains about this in her diary. She says that fish is very dear in my budget and not worth the price of nourishment. I've always been used to making hotel meals, as the boys call them, soup, a savoury and a sweet. If one is a good cook and manager, it's the cheapest way in the long run. As well as constraints being placed on access to unrationed goods, there were also constraints placed on clothing. This is because the working class only received 66 coupons, which was only enough to purchase one whole outfit, and they could only afford to buy what was called utility clothing, which was introduced in order to economise on precious materials. And many complained that these clothes lacked durability, such as George Springett, who was a conscientious objector in Kent. He dismissed the utility clothing as shoddy stuff, and his wife also complained that the clothes did not offer the pleasure of self-expression. So how did the working class respond to these issues? One way was through self-reliance. The families of manual workers responded to the shortages of meat by keeping their own chickens and pigs. Most urban pigs were fed on scraps collected from strategically placed bins in the streets, and they were fattened up and killed for pork, bacon and ham, which was distributed amongst the families in a neighbourhood or in a workplace. Chickens were also often kept because the price of poultry was very expensive at local shops. Neela Last recalls the struggle of trying to feed her hens. In her diary entry, she says, "I'll pick every bit of seeded grain I can get, and every scrap of both grass seed and corn I can save." In fact, the whole of Britain became part-time chicken farmers. This is because they could be kept anywhere. They could be kept in gardens, backyards, garden sheds, and on rooftops and balconies. However, self-reliance didn't just come in the form of keeping animals, it also came in the form of the Dig for Victory campaign, which helped to mitigate the shortages of unrationed fruits and vegetables. By the end of the war, there were actually 24 different variants of leaflets that had been produced by the Ministry of Food, which gave advice on agriculture. The advice ranged from digging up your lawn to make a vegetable patch to tearing out crops that weren't very useful, such as oysters and sweet peas, and instead replacing them with more useful crops, more nutritious crops, such as runner beans and turnips. It also the leaflets also said that if it wasn't practical to dig up something in your garden, you could actually grow vegetables on top of the Anderson shelter, the bomb shelter. In fact, this campaign was so successful that it was estimated by the end of the war, over half of the nation's manual workers had an allotment in their back garden, and they were producing about 10% of all the food that Britain consumed. A big part of how the working class tackled issues they encountered with rationing was through the housewives, who utilised their creativity, their resourcefulness, their innovation to mitigate the constraints created by rationing. Women in their roles as housewives and mothers were actually primarily responsible for implementing the policy of rationing on a daily basis. Therefore, during the war, housewifing and motherhood acquired an enhanced sense of national importance, since rationing was vital in both maintaining public order, health and morale. Thus, the housewives' battle on the kitchen front was as critical to victory as that of the soldiers or the worker in essential industries. This is because the dietary changes generated by rationing and shortages altered culinary traditions, and new recipes had to be adapted to wartime, and brand new dishes had to be developed. The general aim was to economise on foods such as meat, eggs, sugar and fat, and to make the most of plentiful foods such as bread, flour, potatoes, and seasonal fruit and vegetables. In fact, there was an avalanche of government propaganda which intended to help housewives cope and raise the awareness of the significance of domestic economies and the maintenance of family health and morale to the wider war effort. For example, a Ministry of Food leaflet declared, "The line of food defence runs through all our homes. By saving food, you may be saving lives." There were also articles in magazines that instructed women how to make the most out of a limited supply of rations and a low income. For example, an article in Good Housekeeping said, 14 shillings per head on food for a family of 5 doesn't allow a lot of margin, especially in wartime when prices are on the up and up. But by using your head and planning in advance as much as possible, you can produce 4 nourishing, well-balanced and quite interesting meals for every day of the week. The new recipes that emerged included mock dishes, vegetarian main courses, and substitutes for commodities such as tea and jam. For example, mock goose consisted of sausage meat, potatoes, cooking apples, and cheese. And there were also vegetarian courses such as the famous Walton pie, which consisted of mixed vegetables and oatmeal topped with potato pastry. Also, commodities such as jam were replaced with crushed parsnips that were laced with flavourings such as pineapple and banana flavourings. However, the working class didn't just improvise when it came to food, they also improvised when it came to producing clothing for their families. For example, housewives knitted jumpers, scarves, balaclavas, socks and mittens for their families at home and for those in the armed forces. Government propaganda often romanticised knitting as a communal activity done in front of a roaring fire by happy women, but as one housewife recollected quite not very enthusiastically, she said, "We didn't do anything else except listen to the wireless radio and knit. We were always knitting." She goes on to say that patching, knitting and darning were time-consuming, boring pastimes, often done after a long day of work or childcare, forced on the working class by necessity, not choice. How did the upper class and middle class of British society respond to rationing, and did they face the same issues that the working class did? Well, when it came to clothing, those in the upper and middle class of society were at quite an advantage. This is because the wealthier shopper could afford to buy more robust and durable clothes at more exclusive stores, whereas the less well-off had to use the same number of coupons for a cheaper government utility garment. For example, stores such as Kay's advertised special items for those who could afford them, such as gambroon trousers, which were produced using a special type of cloth and were apparently designed to be as durable as iron. The upper middle class could also afford to send their clothes to renovation services, such as stores like John Lewis and Peter Jones, which could make dresses out of a pair of flannel trousers. They could turn evening gowns into day dresses. They could turn men's suits and shirts into women's suits and blouses. Another thing as well, let's have a look. Despite the rhetoric of fair shares when it came to food, only a small amount of essential foods were rationed and regulated, whereas unrationed foods still had to be bought through cash. And this means that if you had the money, you obviously could afford to buy these unrationed goods, and you had a much easier war when it came to feeding yourself. The foods that were unrationed included things such as poultry, offal, fish, fruit and vegetables, and there's plenty of examples in people's diaries, in the diaries of upper class people who talk about and boast about the exorbitant amount of money they paid for simple items such as grapes, which were worth about £1 a bunch during the war. The diaries of social elites such as Chips Channon and Harold Nicholson are loaded with references to abundance and luxury. For example, an entry in November 1940 says, 4 magnums of champagne with friends at the Dorchester. London lives well. I've never seen more lavishness, more money spent on food, and more food consumed than tonight. Several surveys actually recorded the public's resentment as such obvious examples of the advantages the rich enjoyed over the poor. Many individuals in the working class felt like, they felt that meals in restaurants should be paid for using coupons instead of cash. This is because the food at restaurants wasn't actually rationed, and rich people could go to very expensive restaurants such as the Ritz and enjoy luxurious foods. So the government, in response to this, actually limited meals in all restaurants to 5 shillings per meal. But this proved to be ineffective, as the rich people could still buy as many meals as they wanted. So they could buy, for example, 5 meals that were worth 5 shillings each. So luxury gormandizing continued throughout the war, and resentment continued to simmer among those unable to afford the same advantages as the upper class and middle class. To conclude the podcast, rationing in Britain was not defined by universal self-sacrifice. This is illustrated by the uneven distribution of unrationed food amongst the classes, and it's also illustrated by the uneven distribution in the quality of clothing amongst all the classes. And the working class also had to adopt numerous methods of self-reliance and improvisation in order to maintain their lifestyle, whereas the middle class of society and upper class of society had disposable income that could be spent on unrationed goods, restaurants, and high-quality garments. I am now going to interview my grandfather about his experience of rationing during the war. So what can you remember from your experience?
I was born in 1939, so right throughout my childhood it was rationing. The earliest thing I can remember would be food that my mother would put on the table. As for meat, we would eat a lot of rabbit.
Yeah.
I remember as a kid going to school when I was about 5 or 6 year old, seeing the rabbits hanging up outside the butcher shop, still the skins on. And my mother used to skin the rabbits and make a stew. I really like rabbit. I've still got a taste for it now.
Mm-hmm.
The only place I've ever seen it is in Durham Marketplace, and if ever we're down there, if there's any rabbit, I'll buy it. Not many people have tasted it. Also, the other meats that were, I remember what my dad used to eat pig's trotters, which were the feet of the pig,
Yeah.
hooves and all, and I never tried them. And I remember going on an errand when I'd be about 7-year-old, just after the war.
Mm-hmm.
7-year-old going to the butcher's with a note to get a sheep's head. And coming back with the sheep's head in the bag and peeping into the bag and seeing the skinned sheep's head in the bag.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother used to, it still had the brains in, by the way, and my mother used to crack it open and take the brains out, and my dad would have them fried for his supper. I never tried it. But you would boil the sheep's head and make a pan of broth, like Scotch broth with barley and vegetables. It was very nice. All the meat on the sheep's head would be in that broth. There was also, I also remember a time when my grandmother had gotten some horse meat from the butchers, which was obviously on the black market, because I think it's still illegal now to eat horse meat. And I remember tasting it, seeing it and tasting it, and it just tasted like beef.
Yeah.
It's the nearest thing I can say, which just tasted like beef. But all this sort of thing went on then. But as a child, I just took everything for granted. There was also, I mentioned the pig's trotters, didn't I? Fish. The fish I can remember was heron. We got loads of heron, and like the rabbit, I've still got a taste for it today.
Mm-hmm.
If ever I see heron, you don't see it very, very often in the fresh fish shops. If ever I see heron, I'll buy it. Really nice fish, but there's not many of them in the North Sea now at the moment, I don't think.
Yeah.
We used to get kippers, which were heron that was smoked, and I've still got a taste for them too, you know.
Mm-hmm.
All these things that were had during the war, I can still remember them, and I must have enjoyed them because if I ever see them, I'll buy them, you know.
Yeah.
And they went on the ration. I remember when I would be about 9 or 10 year old, so it would be just before 1950.
Yeah.
The bananas, it just came on the scene, and I remember the big queues outside the shops for bananas when they're getting bananas in.
Yeah.
I'd never seen a banana in my life before. I've heard of them, but never seen, and having a banana and thinking it was something very special. And also the sweets came off the ration about the same time, about 1950-ish, and I remember queues at the shops for sweets, you know. But all these things, food and that, you know, it was, like I say, I just took everything for granted, but they had to improvise on everything.
Yeah.
I remember my mother baking foods that you don't see now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I still have a go at it now and then. I'll have a go and see puddings in the corn. We'll try that one, like, you know.
Yeah.
Dumplings. I mean, I still do them sometimes. You know, they were a common meal. And I remember when my dad came back from the army. I mean, I was 6 years old before I seen him.
Yeah.
And it would be around about 1947, 48. He was back on his old job and carrying this big sack of, it was actually American food supplies, like ration supplies, which they had for the troops.
Yeah.
And when the Americans left after the war, all this stuff was surplus. And I think they had to pay for it, but I don't know exactly how much it was. But there was a big bag of all sorts of stuff in it. Cigarettes in cans, and tins. There was sweets. There was all sorts of food in that. I remember the dried egg. I remember dried egg during the war. It was like in a powder form.
Yeah.
And my mother used to get it, and it was ideal for making eggy bread or gypsy toast, whatever you want to call it. I remember that. I don't know if you can get it now. I'll look on Amazon, see if you can get it. I'll have some of that. But there were hard times, but like I say, there was loads went on, like people could seem to be able to get stuff that you weren't supposed to have.
Yeah.
And I remember the ration books, and you had to have the coupons to buy anything that was on ration. And that's it, more or less.
Mm-hmm. I would like to thank my grandfather for participating in the podcast, and I would like to thank you all for listening. Tune in next week when we will be covering the topic of gender on the home front. And goodbye.